All right, it's noon time. Askwekwas Miss Kanupiam. My name's Crystal Maz Baker. I am Tamaquag's education manager, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn. I am still admitting people while I go through this, so bear with me as I admit people and welcome all of you.
Crystal, you could make me the host and I can do that.
That would be good. Let me see if I can figure out quickly how to do that. I have to find you, right?
I reclaimed host. I'm host.
Oh, very good. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Crystal Maz Baker. Welcoming you to today's Lunch and Learn, the first in our series for 2025. First, this free educational program has been made possible with the support of many, including the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, the United Way, the Island Foundation, and of course, community supporters and donors like you. So Tamaquag's theme for this year is the preservation of history. 2025 marks the 350th anniversary of the Great Swamp Massacre, a topic we will cover this year along with many others to inform and educate on the significance of Indigenous history, perspective, and the changes and challenges faced by Native peoples throughout the development of what is now called America. Just a quick reminder, please place yourself on mute. Feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat, and we will address them as time allows at the end of the presentation. So our guest today is Mack Scott, historian, educator, and citizen of the Narragansett Tribal Nation. Mack is a visiting assistant professor at the Ruth J. Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice and Director of Undergraduate Studies for the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative at Brown University. Mack's work focuses on the intersections of race and identity and employs agency as a lens to view and understand the voices, stories, and perspectives of traditionally marginalized peoples. Today's presentation is entitled Signature Sovereigns, the War for Connecticut, the Treaty of Hartford, and the Fallacy of Settler Supremacy. So I welcome Mack Scott.
Oh, thank you, Crystal. And I just imagine like applause in my head there. But I'd like to thank Tamaquag and everyone at Tamaquag. They've been a supporter of mine since I've started my investigations and explorations of history. So I'm really thankful for this opportunity. And thank you for being here. I know it's your lunch break or lunchtime, and you're sharing it to learn history, which is pretty awesome. So I'm thankful for that too. So I'll just start. I imagine that some of you might not know who I am, so I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about myself and kind of what informs my scholarship. So my mother is Wanda Hopkins. She may be on, I think she is. And she married my stepfather, whose name is Donald Hopkins, when I was about 10 years old. And I only refer to Dondi, some of you know him as Dondi, as my stepfather for accuracy because he is my father. But prior to the marriage of my mother and father, I lived in Providence with my grandparents, Charles and Evangeline Hankinson. Evangeline's maiden name is Babcock, and her father was Thomas Babcock, whose father was Charles Babcock Jr., whose father was Charles Babcock Sr., whose father was Paul Babcock, and Paul's mother was Ruhama Babcock. And Ruhama was born in the Narragansett country decades before Euro-Americans established the United States. Therefore, my family holds long and abiding and uninterrupted ties to the Narragansett country. My grandmother, Evangeline, moved from Alton to Providence when she married my grandfather, and I spent my earliest years in the city. I was what some might call a city Indian. I visited and was closer to my relatives who lived in Providence, and I attended programming at the Rhode Island Indian Council and went to the powwow in August. But that was about it until I moved to Old Mill Road. And for those of you who do not know where Old Mill Road is, it is one of the roads that bisects the Narragansett Reservation in Charlestown. So I went from visiting the area and my South County relatives once a year or so to living with them on the land. The reservation was literally my backyard. And as I explored its reaches and swam in its waters, I became aware of my connection to those who had inhabited those spaces before me. So what, right? When I would turn in papers in graduate school, my professors would always ask, "So what?" Right? They wanted to know why what I had written mattered. So the brief glimpse into my background and the scholarship that I will share with you today are interrelated, and that is the so what. In my talk today, I won't share some new obscure source that I uncovered in archival research. Unfortunately, I did not find Mine to Know Me's journal under a rock while I was playing in the woods as a child. Um, but growing up on the land and at the feet of elders gave me a different way of seeing and understanding. I liken it to watching TV where the camera like blurs the picture in the foreground so that you can concentrate on what's happening in the background. And this is what today's talk will do. To better understand the foreground, I will focus on and describe what's happening in the background. Focusing on the periphery to better know the world and experiences of Native peoples is necessary because Euro-Americans who created and preserved the documentary record placed themselves and their worldviews in the foreground. Therefore, I read between the lines to recover the unspoken and undocumented truths. In my talk today, I offer a case study about how to incorporate Indigenous beliefs and value systems and how they can help us to better understand the past. So I'm going to take you back to the year 1636. And the newcomers residing in Plymouth and Boston are in trouble. Their fledgling outposts are not self-sustaining, and their homeland has been in turmoil since the king dissolved Parliament in 1629. Unable to rely on their English benefactors for support, the newcomers needed a way to sustain themselves, and tapping into the lucrative fur trade seemed an obvious answer. However, the prospect presented a few challenges. One, Plymouth and Boston were far from the epicenters of the fur trade that traversed the Pequot River. The newcomers could not commandeer this trade because the Pequot could raise as many fighters in a conflict as the combined forces of Plymouth and Boston could field. Therefore, the newcomers' only hope for survival and self-sufficiency laid with the Dawnland's most numerous and influential community, the Narragansett. It was the fall of 1636 when the Bay Colony sent a formal delegation to negotiate a military alliance with the Narragansett. Edward Johnson, one of the diplomats sent to parley with the natives, fretted as he explained in his diary that if the two parties failed to reach an agreement, the Bay Colony might the Bay Colony might be attacked by a large contingent of Narragansetts. The fear was well placed because in 1636, the Narragansett alone could raise more warriors for battle than the entire populations of Plymouth and Boston, including all of their men, women, and children. In fact, although many imagine that the Dawnland was a desert, as King James claimed in 1620, in 1636, the Narragansett Confederation was larger than the population of Manchester, England's second largest city. However, no agreement was reached between the newcomers and the Narragansetts in 1636. And the situation became more tense when the Pequot leaders killed an English trader who attempted to establish himself along the riverfront. Sensing that war was looming, both the Pequot and the newcomers sent delegations to the Narragansett to appeal for an alliance. Boston and Plymouth enlisted the help of their recently exiled countryman, Roger Williams, who had found refuge among the Narragansett. Williams's report that his effort had been preceded by the Pequot, who had already sought an alliance with the Narragansett, likely sent fear through the colonies. Bay Colony leaders instructed Williams to secure a meeting with the Narragansett in Boston. By all accounts, when the Narragansett arrived in the colonial stronghold, they were royally entertained. For the newcomers knew that securing an alliance was their only hope for prosecuting a war against the Pequot. For whatever reason, although I'm sure you can imagine why the details of this alliance would not have been saved, the newcomers did not preserve the terms of the agreement with the Narragansett. Still, there is no question that the natives held the upper hand in these negotiations. Although Williams would have us believe that he alone, quote, smashed to pieces any possibility of alliance between the Pequot and the Narragansett, the truth is that a league with the newcomers was in the Narragansett's best interest. Well, at least in 1637. The problem with the propensity of scholars to interpret the history exclusively from a Western-facing lens is that these narratives are not benign. The settler colonial framework seeks to not only explain, but also to justify historical outcomes. In this sense, the War for Connecticut, a complexity of intertribal, intercolonial, and international diplomacy, is reimagined as the Pequot War, a simplistic and racialized struggle for control of what is now called the Connecticut River. Proponents of this deterministic interpretation concede that some natives did fight on the side and at the behest of the colonists, but contend that supermen like Williams persuaded their native allies to forsake their own interest. Chroniclers explain that the Narragansett had an opportunity to change the course of history, but they chose wrong. The Pequot warning about the dangers of English strangers, explained one historian, was heard too late. By joining forces with the English, another scholar wrote, the Narragansetts gave up forever the possibility of a unified Indian resistance. Or the Narragansetts could not see that far into the future, as another scholar postulated. Thus, the account proffered by Williams and recounted by many not only helps to explain the decline and dispossession of indigenous peoples throughout the Dawnland, but it also absolves the newcomers by placing the blame for this eventuality on the natives who failed to, quote, see that far into the future. And they gave up forever, not just the possibility of unified resistance, but also their birthright. However, a more nuanced analysis of the conflict emerges when we obscure the claims made by Euro-Americans and foreground the experiences of indigenous communities, thus seeking to appraise decisions, actions, and outcomes from an Eastern-facing lens. While working out their agreement in Boston, the Narragansett leaders sought and received assurances from the newcomers that women and children would not be harmed. Miantonomi's demand was in keeping with longstanding customs that saw individuals and even whole communities moving from the protection and dominion of one polity to another as political realities and fortunes changed. Colonial leaders were aware of these social migrations, and some even suspected that the Narragansett only participated in the conflict to, quote, augment their own kingdom, as they wanted to be the only lords of the Indians. After the war, when Puritan leaders condemned the Narragansett for harboring some of the remaining Pequot, The natives responded that, quote, the Pequot were good men, their friends, and they would fight for them and protect them. Although the Narragansett likely extended their power and influence by incorporating the defeated Pequot, the Puritan attack on Omowakuke left little misconception about what the colonial leaders hoped to accomplish. After setting the fort ablaze, the newcomers surrounded the encampment and shot down anyone who tried to escape, leaving the great majority of the Pequot to burn, man, woman, and child. The scene was so gruesome that rank-and-file soldiers were distressed by the cold-blooded slaughter of seeing the Indians fleeing the burning village. However, others found solace in the flames, as William Bradford later wrote, quote, it was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire and the streams of blood quenching the same. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave praise to God. For the Narragansett, the massacre was too much to endure, and many abandoned the effort, decrying the tactics employed by the colonists, saying, match it, that it is not because it is too furious and slays too many men. After the, quote, sweet sacrifice in what is now Mystic, Connecticut, the Puritans and their remaining indigenous allies hunted down those who had survived the flames, killing some and selling others into slavery. In an unabashed attempt to supplant the Pequot, Puritan leaders even went so far as to forbid any survivors from uttering the name of the defeated foe. The Narragansetts desired to adopt remaining remnant Pequots into their community comported with longstanding social, political, and cultural mores. This, and not deference to the supposed persuasive prowess of men like Williams, no matter how forcefully the Reverend proclaimed the extent of his influence, was likely the primary reason the Narragansetts lent support to the newcomers during the war. However, some of the provisions outlined in the treaty after the conflict did not align with enduring Dawnland traditions. Still, chroniclers have been almost unanimous in concluding that the conditions outlined in the Treaty of Hartford in 1638 evidence that the Narragansett and Mohegan signatories submitted to the authority of the Connecticut colonist. For example, a book published in 2018 claimed that the Narragansetts, quote, forfeited their rights and that Connecticut was to determine who could do what in the former Pequot lands. However, the conclusion is made absurd when one considers that in 1640, Connecticut's non-Indigenous population totaled 1,472. Although we do not know the exact number of colonists residing in Hartford in 1638, it was undoubtedly significantly less. The Narragansett Confederacy numbered around 30,000 persons before the conflict, and it is illogical to conclude that the Narragansett would have forfeited their autonomy and submitted to the authority of a community that was 1/13 their size. Still, according to the treaty, the Narragansetts agreed to empower Connecticut to settle disputes between indigenous polities and to submit to fines levied by the colonists. What is perhaps most suspect is the provision stating that the natives consented to kill or turn Pequot refugees over to the colonists. As stated, before agreeing to support the newcomers, the Narragansett sought guarantees from Boston that the Pequot women and children would not be harmed and that captives be, quote, not enslaved, but used kindly, have houses and goods and fields given to them. Hence, it is unlikely that the Narragansetts agreed to the treaty's terms as the colonists recorded them. Instead, the treaty documented what one scholar described as aspirational assertions of sovereignty. Colonial texts, another writer noted, attempted to interpret the significance of the colonial experiment for a transatlantic audience. The Treaty of Hartford constituted an effort to establish a signature sovereignty, a declaration of authority or power that existed only on paper. Many newcomers, especially those in colonies with royal charters, continued to call the region claimed by those residing in Hartford the Pequot country until 1662, when King Charles II issued a charter affirming Connecticut's claims to the area. Thus, during the 24 years in the interim, the Treaty of Hartford was the charter and the only thing lending legitimacy to the English settlement. The colonists who hoped to establish themselves in the Pequot country were not signatories to the Boston Agreement. Therefore, the Treaty of Hartford established the river colony's supposed sovereignty and broadcast Connecticut's professions of legitimacy to their rivals in Boston and possibly to benefactors across the Atlantic. In stating that the Pequot country was, quote, now the English's by conquest, the newcomers used the document to declare a false authority that undergirded their claims of possession and rightful occupancy. What is more, Connecticut's colonial leaders did not seek to incorporate the indigenous inhabitants into their new colony. Instead, the newcomers worked to enslave and sell some of the natives to traders in far-flung locations. The forced removal of Pequots inspired great concern among the region's native population. Dawnland communities believed that people cannot be separated from the land. The Creator gave us this place, writes the Narragansett elder Dawn Dove. This is the place that is our past, present, and future. Our life, our existence is wrapped up in the blanket of this beautiful earth. Our children are the inheritors of this place, this land, this Mother Earth. The landscape the elder references is not abstract. For Miss Dove, the blanket that cradles her community is in a specific place. Or as Lisa Brooks explains, invocations of land or nature embody a physical, actual, material relationship to an ecosystem present in a definable place. Native people cannot be divorced from the land, as the newcomers asserted in their treaty, because their lifeblood, their cosmology, axology, and epistemology is rooted in the land. The bones of their ancestors are interred in the same earth that continues to sustain their communities. The stories, histories, and identities of Dawnland people are interwoven into a specific geography. The land matters profoundly, argues one scholar, tied to cherished stories, beloved foods, family memories, vital goods, and influential ancestors. The land is sacred. Narragansett translates to people of the small point. Wampanoag means people of the first light. The landscape and the people are one. As Miss Dawn revealed, the Narragansett country is more than a territory. It is our existence. Hence, as was true for the entirety of the treaty, the clause calling for Connecticut to take possession of the Pequot country without incorporating the Pequot only made sense to the Western audience for whom the document was created. In July 1637, before the treaty was penned in Hartford, Roger Williams reported to John Winthrop that he met with Miantinomi and that the men discussed what would happen to the defeated Pequot. According to Williams, Miantinomi confirmed that 6 refugees had recently arrived in the Narragansett country to pledge their allegiance. The party offered 3 guns to the sachem to prove their sincerity. The group informed Miantinomi that they represented a much larger contingent of Pequots who waited word from the emissaries. Williams proposed that Miantinomi imprison the group on an island, but the sachem objected, saying, quote, they were most of them families. Chroniclers have almost exclusively interpreted such cross-cultural exchanges as evidence of the deference that Native people showed to the newcomers. And this is likely precisely what many chroniclers and commentators intended as they worked to interpret and explain their interactions to each other and to their transatlantic audience. For example, Williams sought to situate himself and other colonial leaders as authorities, writing that the Narragansetts would defer to Mr. Governor, but that they were inclined to mercy and to give the Pequots their lives. The inference is that the newcomers were the decision makers and that the natives did their bidding. The so-called Mr. Governor was John Winthrop Jr., the son of the Bay Colony governor and the head of the fledgling settlement at Hartford. It behooved Williams to interpret the natives as passive because it confirmed his supposed influence over the Narragansett and reaffirmed his status as a diplomatic linchpin. Moreover, the deference that colonists imagined indigenous peoples paid to their interests and desires confirmed in their minds the workings of God's divine plan. The only account we have of this discourse between Williams and Miantinomi comes from Williams. And as we have seen, the Reverend had the propensity for self-aggrandizement. And the Reverend had a good reason to continue positioning himself as the fulcrum in post-war diplomacy. Williams wrote that he told Miantinomi, quote, they might hunt in the woods, and this satisfied him. In granting, quote, permission to the Narragansett to inhabit the Pequot country, Williams refashioned himself as the mouthpiece of the colonial leadership. However, when discussing the disposition of the Pequot territory with the Reverend, Miantinomi likely affirmed his intent to occupy the region and did not seek permission. Although Narragansett access to Pequot lands was part of the agreement reached in Boston, the Connecticut colonists claimed the territory to legitimize their endeavor. By agreeing that the Narragansett could access the disputed lands, Williams communicated the intent of colonial leaders, regardless of Connecticut's proclamations and contestants to the previous agreement. But in framing the decision as a grant of permission, Williams also evidenced how colonists imbued and imagined a false authority over Native peoples into their discourse as aspirational assertions of sovereignty. It is revealing that Williams, having also sought asylum among the Narragansett and after having lived among the natives for more than a year, was not more sympathetic to the plight of the Narragansett's Pequot kinfolk. The Reverend's lack of empathy was emblematic of his failure to embrace his role in his adopted community. Even so, the group's request for sanctuary was consistent with longstanding social and political practices. Kinship, writes Patty Carvec, Patty Carvec, carries specific responsibilities, and the fact that at least 76 Pequots believed, however trepidatiously, that they could find sanctuary among the Narragansett spoke to the importance of kinship ties and the responsibilities engendered by these family connections. In a key, Roger Williams wrote that Nequenum translates as I am going home. He explained that Nequenum is a solemn word among them, and that no one will stop a person who, after some absence, is going to visit family and uses this word. One can imagine that when the Pequot fled to the Narragansett country, and called on their kinship ties to seek asylum, they spoke the word Nequenum, because in many respects they were going home. However, such truths can only be revealed when we shift our perspective and bring what has been relegated to the background to the fore. Although Williams wrote about Nequinum, he clearly did not understand the concept as related to the Narragansett's Pequot kinfolk. Therefore, we must remain critical of the postulations and declarations made by chroniclers as they sought to interpret their world by placing the beliefs, values, and worldviews of Indigenous peoples in the background. We have to change our perspective. Katapatash. So thank you. That concludes my presentation. I thank you for listening, and I know that we have plenty of time for questions.
Thank you, Mac. I invite you to put any of your questions or comments in the chat, and Mac is going to spend some time answering any of them. Just going to pull up. I'm not the techiest person, just bear with me. So, Mac, one of the questions that we have coming through is there a source you would recommend for students that informed your research?
Oh, so this is a good question. So a source inform the research. So yes, and if we can get whoever asked the question, I'll send this article to them. But there was an article that was published, I want to say maybe 2020 or about there, where it was a rediscovery of the Treaty of Hartford. So the Treaty of Hartford, all of the stipulations and the agreements were taken from diaries, right? Contemporaneous diaries where people wrote down what the treaty said. And for some reason, a lot of the stipulations that are part of those treaties, of that specific treaty, were not in those diaries, right? The points where it said that the native peoples would defer, right? That they would, take the Connecticut would have authority over them. All of that stuff was in there. But all of the things that Connecticut had to do, right, or that the colonists had to do, was absent in those diary pieces. And a scholar was searching in the archives in London, and they uncovered a longer version of the Treaty of Hartford. And in that longer version, I think it went from like something like 8 clauses to 14 clauses. So there was obviously a lot more that was in the longer version. And all of those clauses that were absent were what the colonists had to abide by, right? So all the things that they had to commit to doing as part of that treaty. But even that treaty was, not the full thing either. So just understanding that, the documents that we have and we read are created and preserved for a reason, right? The people preserved in their diaries what they wanted their posterity to know about this agreement. What was preserved in London was a little bit different, right? It was a little bit more about what was supposed to happen. And then even that, right? Those things that you don't see, you don't know, those background pieces, that's kind of that's what's informs my scholarship, try to understand and contextualize, well, how come the 1,000 people living in Hartford can claim authority over all these indigenous peoples? Or why would they even want to do that? Or why would they need to do that, right? And understanding that context lets us know more about it. So the source specifically, I think, would be that treaty and the article that talks about the uncovering of it, and just to be able to share with students that what we think we know changes over time as we see it from different perspectives and have different pieces of evidence.
Thank you, Mac. I did get her email address. I will provide that to you after, so you can send her that information. I have another question. So coming from one of our Tamaquag staff, we have a presentation called Roger Williams, Friend or Foe. We don't answer that question, but we leave it up to the listener to decide. How would you describe the relationship between Roger Williams and the Narragansett?
So that's a very Interesting question. It's a great question, and it's something that we haven't wrestled with previously. The book that I was mentioning that was published in 2018 is about how Roger Williams and Rhode Island and the Narragansett are on the same team, right? And that they're friends. And I mean, there's a lot of it's them versus the world, it's them versus the Puritans and the rest of them. So we haven't been very critical of that relationship, but like all of the geography that we do when we imagine these historical figures to be larger than life and without blemish or without faults, that's a mistake, right? And I think that the way that we have imagined Roger Williams is not realistic. He was a person, he was self-interested, and in the way that we try to describe him, we don't see the self-interest. But it was in Roger Williams' best interest that he interpreted Native peoples as having authority and rights to their land, because if he didn't, then he couldn't be here, right? He couldn't stay in New England. He was getting kicked out by the old rules, right? By the rules that said that the English determined who could be there, right? So obviously he had to come up, well, is there a different way how we can determine who can be here, right? Or what authority you have? There had to be a new authority, right? So their self-interest in this this way in which he places and interprets and talks about his relationship with the indigenous peoples, right? That there's a lot of self-interest in there too.
Hmm.
And I think that a lot of times we don't look at that part.
Hmm. Thank you for that answer. We have another question. What are your aspirations for our future by bringing these truths to light?
Oh, thank you. I like that. It's a great question. And it's a question that I wrestle with a lot more now than I used to. What I mean is, I used to think, well, if people just know, right? If I just tell them, right, and maybe they just don't know, right? They don't know that all of this is part of it. They don't know our side of the story. They don't know that this is what happened. They don't know why a lot of people believe that Native peoples don't exist or they're dead, right? They don't understand all of the history that went into that to creating that narrative and why it was useful and how it's part of settler colonialism and remaking the landscape and all that stuff. And and I think, well, let me tell them, right? Let's know, because once you know, then you'll be like, oh yeah, that's not right. But I don't know, right? Because I think as time goes on, we learn more and more, and we know some of this stuff, and it doesn't change outcomes and behaviors, right? It's like, well, now we know it, but we don't really want to know it. So now we can kind of push it to maybe that's true, but maybe this other thing is true too, and we can kind of push it to the periphery. But but there are some people, right? Some people that don't know, and there are some people that when you do know, um, and when I say no, I mean like all of the history that has worked to create the current context and the outcomes that we experience, right? This is no surprise. Everybody knows that indigenous peoples in this nation have the worst socioeconomic outcomes, right? That's just known. But to understand the specific things that happen to create that reality, then if you know that, then it's kind of like we have these things that we can address, right? We know that this dispossession happened at this time by these people, and this is what, this is how the transfer of wealth happened, and this is why. And then maybe we can address those specific hurts, right? And those specific inequities. And some people I think will, right? I'm sure a lot of people on this call will. But then also when you start talking about that, then it's about, it becomes challenging, right? Because there's it's reparative work that is substantive is hard, right? So sometimes I think, if you know this stuff, the next step is to, well, what can we do about it? And then those are hard questions.
Hmm. Thank you, Mac. I do have a couple other questions coming here, but I would also like to invite anyone who's on, if you're like me, you don't type as quick into the chat. So feel free to put your hand up, and our Tamaquag team will spot your hand, and you can ask your question unmuted if you'd like. So I have a couple of thank yous for an insightful and engaging presentation, and mentioning how very interesting it was. And our next question is, what role do you think treaties can or should play in our current political climate, especially given treaty status as the supreme laws of the land?
Oh, so that's interesting. I think if I'll put a plug in for Ned Blackhawk's book, which came out, The Rediscovery of America. It was like last year. It's a very recent book, and it's very good. And there's a large part of that book where he's talking about treaties as the supreme law of the land, right? That's how they were framed, and then kind of the evolution of that thought, right? Because at one point, these treaties helped to define the nation, right? And what it could do, and when it was nascent, right? Figuring out, its baby steps and how to react. Its relationship with the indigenous population really helped to define what the United States would become, right? So those treaties were the supreme law at that time. But as time went on and those treaties became more limiting for the nation, more problematic, and talking about obligations and things like that, then there was a switch, right, where they're the supreme law of the land, but not really, right? There's all these other things that we can consider when we're trying to lessen treaty obligations and rules. And one of those things that we see happen, especially with communities that are, I call them first contact communities. They are communities that are east of the Mississippi. The reality is a lot of those communities are their interactions and their agreements are with colonial leaders, with England, right, and English leaders. So by the time the United States comes to being, they don't have treaties, right? So those relationships become problematic because does the United States have to honor English treaties with indigenous peoples, right? And then so the question of treaties is a really good one. Obviously, I can't do justice to it now, but I recommend Ned Blackhawk's book and thinking about, how the evolution of how we interpret the treaties, because I think a lot of times in American history, it's what's expedient and what's useful at the time. And treaties were useful at one time, and I think right in the current moment, they're seen as more of a hindrance and problematic. I mean, the United States outlawed treaty making, right? So, it became a problem for them.
I didn't know that myself, that they outlawed treaty making. Interesting. So much more to learn. I'm going to scroll back up here for a minute. I think there was another question. Oh, here's one. So thank you for bringing this background into focus for us. How are we to see the background and foreground in one picture beyond right and wrong?
Yeah, so hopefully that's what I try to do, right? I know that. So there's like I think of history like a pendulum swing, right? So it was so far on one side at one time, and there's everybody pushes it back to the other side. No, this way, this way. What I'm saying, I guess, is you just have to be critical because it seems almost intuitive to be critical of people who have been targeted or marginalized, their stories and their perspectives and the way they understand history and just reality. It seems like it's almost natural to be critical of those stories. But then we have this westernized mind frame where we believe that the way in which Western society documents and tells their stories has to be correct, right? And I would just say that, look at the Treaty of Hartford, look at the proclamations and the things that people say in their documents, and not just the document itself as being true, right? Think about why are they saying that? Why are they writing that? Who were the signatories? Why would they agree to this? Why would I try to make it quite, obvious here, but why would a community as large as the Narragansetts say that like 1,000 people can tell them what to do? That makes zero. That's what I'm saying, right? You got to be critical of these documents, right? How could you say that in the document? But and what scholars have done for a long time is say, yeah, and I kind of pointed that out in the recent book. Yeah, Connecticut told them what to do. Really? I don't know, right? So what I'm saying is, to you have to try to see both, right? And you have to give both equal weight and equal standing. Just because it's written down doesn't mean that it's true, and doesn't mean that you can't be critical of it. And just because it's not written down doesn't mean that it's true. I can't tell you how many times historians and scholars affirm Native stories, right, that have been passed on forever. I can give you an example. Well, I don't know if I'll give that example, but I could give you an example right now of how that happens, but how oral histories become true when the documents that people research and find catch up to them, and they'll be like, oh yeah, what they said was true, right? So what I'm saying is you got to kind of give equal weight to both sides of the stories, even though our tradition and our inclination is to preference one over the other.
Mm-hmm. I would even just throw in there that sometimes it's hard to give that kind of weight to all histories because we are hundreds of years later, and we were not documenting our own histories or stories from our perspectives in those days. And so we're hearing it now in present days from historians like yourself and others, and are not often given the same amount of credibility as these old documents that have been in collections or archives or other things like that as well. Let's see. Sorry, I'm slow with the chat. Here's one. So since treaties between sovereign tribal nations and the U.S. has ended, what does recognition for tribes look like now? Example, new administration deciding to recognize Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina.
So that's an excellent question. I have to confess I don't know a whole lot about the Lumbee situation. What I do know is that they kind of were already federally recognized, but there was some stipulations in which they couldn't have all of the same rights and privileges as federally recognized tribes, right? Communities. I know that they state recognized for sure. And it's not treaties, right? So nobody's making treaties with the United States government anymore. But the United States does have to honor treaties that are in existence, right? That were signed long ago. The relationship now, especially between federally recognized communities that are not treaty based, so like the Lumbee will be because of I know President Trump's letter or memo where he's saying that the Lumbee should be recognized. What that relationship is saying is that there are certain so backtracking a little bit, the United States has for their own purposes, right? Because it was in the interest at the time, defined Native communities as dependent domestic nations, right? And what that meant was it established this ward relationship with the United States and indigenous communities. So as the ward, there has to be some sort of caretake, right? That's part of wardship. So a lot of the federal programs that are part of the the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the programs they have education programs, health programs, all of these different things, job work programs. That's part of that wardship relationship. So it's not like, and that's different than treaty relationships, right? In treaty relationships, indigenous communities, mostly west of the Mississippi, have specific clauses in those treaties that the government has to do. So like rations, right? So things like that are part of those treaty relationships where the federal government has to actually supply food rations to the community because it's in the treaty. The I guess, privileges and rights that are associated with Indigenous communities now that don't have treaties with the federal government are through that wardship relationship.
Thank you, Matt. I have another question. What role do you feel the Department of Education should play as far as the requirement of these histories being taught or shared, across the board from one end of the country to the other?
Yeah, I think they should be involved and make it mandatory and put it into, I mean, some of you probably know that it's not even part of Rhode Island's curriculum, right? So, but the thing why it matters is because if you don't talk about it, you don't put it in, then you are lessening it, right? You're excluding it. Exclusion means that it's not important, right? We're telling people what is important. And if we exclude entire communities from the curriculum, we're saying that entire community is not important, right? To the realities that you experience. And to say that Native peoples were not important to the realities that you experience as Americans every day is crazy, right? And the only way you can say that is if you ignore those histories and you don't talk about those connections, you don't talk about the things that have happened in the past that create your experiences today, right? And the way that you can do that is by just saying, we're just not going to cover it. We're just not going to put it in our curriculum.
Thank you, Mac. So you're getting some thank yous for responses to some of the questions, some of the answers that you gave. Comment, great presentation. Thank you. And thanks to Tamaqua Museum for presenting the series, and you're absolutely welcome. We have a few more minutes. If there are any more questions, I don't see any more in the chat. Did anyone have their hand raised?
Oh, I did. I actually, Loren just reminded me. I don't know how I didn't think of this, but talking about this curriculum issue, I've been in part of this project, and Loren has been part of it with the Simmons Centers for the last 4 years now in developing curriculum that teachers can use in Rhode Island, right, and in New England to talk about Indigenous and Black communities and their contributions. And we have actually a launch event. We have a website that has the curriculum, has all of the resources and materials you would need, lesson plans, handouts, everything you would need for students to be able to kind of explore this curriculum, plug and play for teachers. And we have an event coming up in 2 days on the 29th at the Simmons Center at noon. Of course, you're welcome to go. Maybe we can put a link into that event. But this is some of the effort that's happening to talk about Indigenous and Black experience and how that's make it part of the curriculum to make the relevancy and contribution of those communities important and known. Thank you for the reminder, Lorraine.
So I just want to say thank you again, Mac, for this enlightening presentation. We're nearing the end of our time together. Thank you to all of you who joined us today. And I hope you'll join us next month on February 24th for another presentation as part of our series. Linford Fisher will be our guest presenter next month, speaking on surviving enslavement during the War for New England, 1675 to 1676. Also, you're welcome to join us tomorrow for Tamaqua Museum's virtual book club from 7 to 8 p.m. We will meet tomorrow night to discuss Carlo Magno, a historical fiction novel by renowned Narragansett tribal citizen author John Christian Hopkins, and all are welcome whether you've read the book or not. And also on February 5th, we will be welcoming John for an author conversation at the Cross Mills Library. Please come out and join us for that. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Be sure to check out our website for these events and more. And have a lovely afternoon. We thank you all for joining us today. Pish Kanash, and we will see you next time.
Before
Thank
you
you.
click off, Crystal, can you leave it
Yes.
up for just an extra minute? Because I did pop the event at Brown in the chat just to give people a chance to grab it if they want it.